Our Business Unity South Africa says that South Africa's public sector wage payroll costs are too high. It's also rising too quickly and not being supported by commensurate productivity gains. BUSA recently commissioned Intellidex, a local capital markets and financial services research company, to conduct an assessment. Joining us tonight is BUSA CEO, Vusi Mavuso. Good evening and thank you so much for your time. Let's talk then about this Intellidex report and what exactly it has found when it comes to wage bills in the public sector.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for inviting me. And actually, I'm the BUSA board member. Cash Provider is the BUSA CEO. So the reason why the board of BUSA, Kathy, decided to commission this research is precisely because we wanted to have an objective set of data that can inform the engagements between ourselves as social partners in as far as looking at how do we enable a public service that is sustainable, that is productive, and that is definitely remunerated accordingly. And the research actually revealed very interesting statistics, and very interesting information. But it was no surprise to us as business, because I think this is the position that we've always assumed, and I think we have always known, that the public service in this country actually doesn't fare well when you look at how it actually compares to other countries and on a benchmarking perspective, as it were. So the research has found that our public service is definitely unusually well remunerated. It has found that the public sector wages in South Africa in particular is higher than the average 46 countries that the IMF has actually looked at. It found that in terms of the payroll costs in South Africa, and how those fare in as far as GDP is concerned, in as far as public spending is concerned, and in as far as tax revenues are concerned, they are unusually higher than what the global norm is. It has found that we definitely remunerate our public service servants much more higher, than what you are seeing from an international standards perspective. It has definitely found that when you look at the increases that our public service has received over the years, and in this instance, we looked at the data from 2007 right up until 2019, which shows that the average growth of public sector wages has actually been on average about 10.5%. And on a compounded perspective, over the past 12 years, it has really been 78%. And it has found that that is actually out of kilt, in terms of what you're seeing in other countries. And here we are looking at developed countries. We are looking at countries that are performing much more better from a fiscal perspective. We are looking at countries that are actually more solid, and that are actually more, stronger from an economic perspective, and whose economic trajectories are actually doing much better. So now that we know what we know, Kathy, there is no reason whatsoever that we shouldn't more vigorously, look at this issue of the public sector wage bill in this country. And there is no reason why we shouldn't deal from an evidence-based and an evidence-led perspective with this contentious issue of the public sector wage bill.
Vusi, as BUSA, you have, as Business Leadership South Africa, you've consistently raised the issue of the public wage bill, and I think we can see responses to that coming out of the Treasury. You look at some of the decisions that have been made around staying the increases and what the plans are, at least from the Finance Minister, in terms of that public wage bill over the coming years. I'm interested to know, now that you have this data, what are you going to be doing with it, and how are you going to be adding then to the conversation that is already taking place in Treasury about public servants and the salaries they receive?
As I've said, Kate, this allows us to have a more fact-based and evidence-led discussion in terms of what the numbers are from a South African perspective and how we fare compared to international standards. So as you know, unfortunately, business can do very little except put the facts on the table. It is government that is actually going to have to act on this. But I'm hoping that as social partners, we can therefore have a basis upon which we can discuss this issue. So this means that government labor civil society and indeed business are going to have to go back to NEDLAC and really engage from a perspective of, now that we know the facts, now that we know the evidence, how are we going to proceed on this matter? I think we're also going to have to be very clear, Katie, that we cannot avoid, to actually deal with this matter, because if we avoid to deal with this issue, what is at risk for the countries? That's the fiscal debt crisis that Tito and Treasury have actually been talking about, that is actually going to be in South Africa in the next 3 years. It means that this is definitely going to be much sooner. It actually means that we may lose our economic sovereignty as a country much more sooner than what we thought. It means that we are really at a risk of a further downgrade. We know that Moody's in particular has mooted the issue that South Africa could be further downgraded to sub-investment grade, because we are clearly failing to deal with this issue of fiscal consolidation that the credit rating agencies have actually been talking about. It means that the warning by the World Bank that we received about 3-4 weeks back, that we cannot continue to fund, or rather to borrow to fund salaries, and we cannot continue to borrow to fund these dysfunctional SOEs, means that we're actually going to have to hit that call, because now we've got evidence to that effect. And it also means that if we go out there to the global capital markets to try and borrow, our loans might be met with much more tighter conditionalities than what we actually are looking to receive as a country. But I think when all is said and done, in a nutshell, Kathy, it means that if we ignore this evidence, if we ignore all the facts that we have on the table, South Africa could be another failed African state, precisely because we are avoiding dealing with some of these difficult and contentious issues that we actually need to confront as a country.
Busi, my reading of the situation is that, despite the fact that, as we've talked about, there has been that indication from Treasury that there are ways that the government plans on dealing with this. But when I listen to you carefully in terms of how you're intending to use this research, it sounds to me like you feel that the state has not gone far enough in dealing with the matter of the public service salaries, and that in fact you may well be looking to make a case for why there can be even further cuts, let alone not having salary increases, but that it would be justified to have further cuts to some of the salaries.
It definitely would be justified. But you see, I don't know if we can sit here and say that the state has not done much in terms of dealing with this issue, because I think we saw how the finance minister literally threw the kitchen sink at the unions, I think 2-3 budget speeches ago, where he actually finally decided to tackle this bull by the horns and actually, made a very decisive statement and came out very strongly in as far as the issue of the public sector wage bill is concerned, knowing very well that there was going to be serious pushback from the labor unions. So let's agree that we are not dealing with a homogeneous group called government. We know that we've got a divided government. We know that we've got a government that is pulling in different directions. We know that we've got a government that is driving different agendas, which definitely makes it difficult, for this ANC-led government to decisively, address this contentious issue, as it were. But to your point, you are correct. This means that Treasury can now start looking at how do they affect downward adjustments to the payroll, by either reducing wages, by either reducing a headcount, or actually doing both. It means that there's going to have to be time frames that are going to have to be put in place over which such adjustments should be undertaken. It means that we need to look at the ratios of our payroll costs, to GDP, and the ratio of our payroll costs to tax revenues, because we are sitting in a situation where the compensation bill of this country, in as far as the public service is concerned, is almost 50% of tax revenues. Now, it cannot be right. We all know, as organizations, as governments all over the world, you need to have a financial philosophy in terms of how much are your payroll costs or your wages going to cost you in relation to revenue. A lot, and I think the rule of thumb in this regard is normally, I think, about between 33% and 40%. So if you are taking more than half, of your revenues two salaries, it doesn't make sense, especially in terms of where we find ourselves in as a country, especially, Kathy, where we have a lot of competing interests in terms of those issues that need, attention, especially when we know that in the last medium-term budget speech, all government units were really given a haircut from a budget allocation perspective. And I think on average, every government unit received about a 5% haircut from a budget allocation. So what, therefore, will justify this ANC-led government to continue giving about 11% increases to the public sector wages when we have been told, that in terms of how they fare and in terms of a benchmarking exercise from an international standards perspective, they are remunerated much higher, than what their international counterparts are actually remunerated. So I think there's going to have to be very decisive action that comes from this. And this allows us to have a debate that is not emotional, a debate that is actually fact-based, and a debate that is evidence-led, which will then position this country and this government to actually make those interventions and take the decisive action that they actually need to take in this regard.
Vusi Mavuso, thank you so much for your time. She's a board member with Business Leadership South Africa.